Hey guys, tonight we're climbing down into the one part of a pirate ship most people never think about at all. The gun deck. Not the black flag, not the buried treasure, not the parrot. The 18 tons of iron, rope and gunpowder sitting just below the waterline that decided, in about 4 minutes, whether a pirate crew ate well for a year or didn't come home at all. We're talking about ships that carried anywhere from 6 guns to more than 40. Crews of 100 men or more packed around barrels of powder that could vaporize a deck in a heartbeat. And a single 1722 battle off the coast of West Africa, where the difference between victory and a hanging came down to which side reloaded faster. Welcome to the gun deck of a Golden Age pirate ship, somewhere in the Atlantic, sometime around 1720. Go ahead and dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe let a fan hum low in the background tonight, the way wind moves through rigging on a becalmed sea. That soft, steady, directionless sound of something enormous doing absolutely nothing in a hurry. You're warm right now, tucked into whatever you're tucked into, and there's no smell of scorched linen or wet rope anywhere near you. That won't be true where we're going. So settle in. Get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Down the companionway, into the dark, toward the guns. You duck your head coming down the ladder, because someone told you to, and you didn't ask why. That's the first lesson of the gun deck. You'll learn most of its rules the same way, half a second before they would have hurt you if you hadn't. The air changes before your eyes adjust, thicker, warmer, carrying the smell of tar, bilge water, and something sharper underneath that you can't quite place yet. That smell is sulfur. You'll come to know it very well. For a moment you just stand there, letting your eyes catch up to the gloom, and the shapes around you slowly resolve into the thing you signed on for, or were pressed into, depending on how your particular Tuesday went. Guns, rows of them, squat and black, chained to the deck on wheeled wooden carriages. Muzzles pointed out through square gun ports cut into the hull. On a modest sloop like the kind favored by pirates working the Caribbean shipping lanes, you might be looking at 8 to 12 of these. On something larger, a captured merchantman refitted for the trade, the number climbs fast. Blackbeard's flagship, by the time he was done arming her, is believed to have carried as many as 40 guns, which made her, for a few months in 1717 and 1718, one of the most heavily armed vessels on the entire Atlantic seaboard, pirate or otherwise. You are not aboard that ship tonight. You're aboard something smaller, more ordinary, and in a strange way that makes it more useful for understanding how most of this actually worked, because most pirate ships were not floating fortresses. They were merchant vessels and captured prizes with guns bolted on wherever they'd fit. Here's the thing about the guns themselves. They are not all the same gun. Someone, it turns out to be the weathered older hand steadying you by the elbow so you don't crack your skull on a deck beam, starts walking you down the row, naming them the way you'd introduce someone to a family of very large, very dangerous relatives. His name is Ned, and he's missing the top joint of 2 fingers on his left hand, which he explains happened to a rope, not a cannon, though give it time. He's the kind of crewman who ends up training every green hand within a week of them coming aboard, not because anyone assigned him to it, but because he's still alive after 9 years at sea, and most of the men who taught him aren't. The squat, thick-barreled guns closest to midships, Ned tells you, are sakers, firing shot around 5 or 6 pounds, with a barrel maybe 8 or 9 feet long, built for punching holes rather than throwing shot a great distance. Farther along are demi-culverins, longer and leaner, throwing a heavier 9-pound ball with more range. The kind of gun you'd want if you were trying to convince a merchant ship to strike her colors from a comfortable distance, rather than get close enough to actually board her. Mixed in are minions, smaller still, and here and there a swivel gun, not mounted on a carriage at all, but pinned to a post along the rail on a metal yoke, small enough for one man to aim and fire, almost like an oversized musket, loaded with anything from a single ball to a fistful of scrap iron and glass that turns it into something closer to an enormous shotgun. 90% of pirate cannon fire, Ned tells you, was never actually meant to kill anyone. It was meant to be heard, and to be seen, and to make the math of surrender look better than the math of a fight. We'll come back to that. What you don't see, anywhere on this deck, is a matched set. That demi-culverin came off a Portuguese trader taken 18 months ago. 2 of the sakers were bought with actual coin, which surprises most people, from a corrupt colonial official happy to look the other way on where a ship's cargo manifest came from. One swivel gun still has a French foundry mark stamped into its breech. Pirate ships were rarely built as warships from the keel up. They were merchant hulls, slavers, sloops, snows, whatever could be taken and adapted, and their armament was a scrapbook of everyone they'd ever robbed. That's not incidental to how the guns worked. That's the whole system. A pirate crew's firepower was, quite literally, assembled prize by prize, which is a detail we'll spend an entire chapter unpacking later tonight, because it turns out arming a ship this way came with its own very specific headaches. Each gunport, you notice once Ned points it out, has a small wooden lid hinged above it, hanging open now but clearly meant to seal shut in rough weather, a simple, obvious feature that turns out to matter enormously. Because a gunport left open in a heavy sea is an open door for the ocean itself. And more than one vessel across the age of sail has been lost to exactly that carelessness. Water pouring in through unlatched ports faster than any pump could hope to clear it. Each barrel, too, has its own small wooden plug called a tompion, fitted snugly into the muzzle whenever the gun isn't actively in use, keeping salt spray and rain out of the bore between engagements. It's a small detail, easy to overlook entirely, but it's exactly the kind of unglamorous housekeeping that separated a gun that fired reliably from one that didn't. And Ned checks every single tompion on this row the same unhurried way he checks the breeching ropes. Because to him, at this point, it's simply part of what a gun is, not a separate chore layered on top of it. None of these gun ports, worth remembering, were part of this ship's original design. She was built, like the overwhelming majority of vessels that ended up serving pirate crews, as an ordinary trading vessel, and every one of these square openings had to be cut into her hull afterward. A real and sometimes structurally risky modification that weakened the very timbers meant to keep the sea on the outside where it belonged. A shipwright doing this work well reinforced the surrounding frame carefully, one doing it hastily, under pressure from a captain eager to get back to sea, sometimes didn't. And the difference showed up later. In exactly the moment a heavy broadside's recoil tested every joint and beam around each newly cut opening at once. The gun deck you're standing on, in other words, is itself a kind of retrofit, a peacetime hull persuaded, sometimes reluctantly, into a shape built for war. Ned raps his knuckle against the nearest gun carriage, and it barely moves. 4 small wooden wheels called trucks, and thick hemp breeching rope looped through a ring bolt in the deck and around the barrel's rear. That rope, he says, is the only thing standing between you and a 2,000-pound cannon becoming a 2,000-pound bowling ball, every single time it fires. You file that away. You'll understand exactly what he means in about 2 chapters' time, and it will not be a comfortable understanding. The swivel guns get a different kind of attention from Ned than the big carriage guns do, and he lingers over one mounted just aft of the row, showing you how it pivots freely on its yoke, light enough for a single man to swing and aim almost like an oversized pistol, rather than something requiring an entire crew. These smaller pieces come into their own in exactly the moment the big guns become useless, once two ships have closed enough for boarding. When a demi-culverin's arc of fire is more likely to hit your own rigging than an enemy deck. A swivel gun, loaded with a fistful of scrap iron, broken glass, and whatever else happens to be handy, can sweep a crowded enemy deck at close range with a spread, wide enough that careful aim barely matters. It's a brutal, close-quarters weapon, built for exactly the chaotic minutes right before a boarding party goes over the rail, and Ned handles the one in front of you with a kind of grim familiarity that tells you he's used it for precisely that purpose more than once. Where the demi-culverins persuade a ship to strike her colours from a comfortable distance, the swivel guns are what's left standing between two crews once persuasion has already failed, and the only question remaining is who boards whom first. The deck beneath your feet isn't flat, either. You notice it once you're paying attention. A gentle curve, called camber, built into every wooden warship and merchantman of the era, so that rainwater and seawater sheet off toward the scuppers instead of pooling. It also means, Ned points out with the flat cheerfulness of a man who has stopped being surprised by anything, that a loose cannonball rolling free on deck during a storm doesn't roll in a straight line. It curves. It hunts. More than one sailor, across the age of sail, lost a leg to a rolling ball that seemed, for a few horrifying seconds, to be actively pursuing him. Congratulations, you've just learned your first gun-deck superstition, and it isn't really a superstition at all. It's physics wearing a scary story's clothes. There's an arithmetic to all of this that Ned makes sure you understand before you leave this row of guns, because it's the arithmetic that quietly governed everything about how a pirate crew actually organized itself. Each gun needs roughly 6 or 7 men to fight it properly, which means a ship carrying 12 guns needs, in principle, somewhere close to 80 or 90 hands just to serve one full broadside at once, and that's before counting the men needed to sail the ship, work the pumps, stand lookout, and do everything else that keeps a wooden vessel afloat and moving. This is precisely why pirate crews tended to run so much larger than an equivalent merchant crew. A merchantman of similar size might sail with a dozen or 15 men total, because she never expected to fight anyone, while a pirate ship of the same tonnage carried 5 or 6 times that number, not for comfort, but because every one of those extra bodies was, in the most literal sense, part of the gun. It's also, Ned points out, exactly why a captured merchant crew so rarely stood a real chance if they chose to resist. The numbers were never close to even, and everyone on both sides of any encounter generally understood that going in. Above the gun deck proper, on the open quarterdeck where the captain and officers stand, the cannon give way to a different kind of firepower entirely. Racks of pistols and muskets, cutlasses hung ready along the rail, and more of those small swivel guns mounted where they can sweep the deck itself rather than the open water beyond it. This is a detail that surprises people expecting the guns to be the whole story. A good portion of a pirate ship's actual violence, when it came to violence at all, happened not between two vessels exchanging cannon fire at range, but in the chaotic, close quarters minutes after a boarding, when pistols and blades did work the big guns physically couldn't. The cannon persuaded a ship to stop. The pistols and cutlasses were what settled things if persuasion, for whatever reason, failed. Both mattered. Neither worked especially well without the other. Above you, barely visible through the gunport, daylight cuts a hard, bright line across the water outside. Down here, everything is shadow and timber and the low creak of a hull working against the swell. Somewhere forward, someone is coiling rope and humming something tuneless. It's almost peaceful. That piece is doing a lot of work right now, because in every direction around you sits enough black powder to turn this entire deck, and everyone standing on it, into splinters and smoke inside of a single unlucky second. Nobody down here talks about that directly. They don't have to. It's why the ropes are checked twice, why open flame is a hanging offence in some articles of agreement, why even Ned, missing 2 fingers to nothing more dramatic than a rope burn, moves around these guns with a care that looks almost like tenderness. You'll understand that tenderness better very soon, once you've seen what these guns actually do, and what it costs the men who serve them. Guns, it turns out, don't stay ready for battle on their own, and this is where Ned's actual job becomes visible rather than just implied. Every few days, weather allowing, the gun crews muster for what's simply called exercise. Not a real action, just the motions of one, run through again and again until the sequence lives in the muscles rather than the mind. Ned worms each barrel first, twisting a corkscrew-tipped rod down the bore to check for anything left behind from the last loading, a scrap of wadding, a splinter of cartridge paper, anything that could smoulder unnoticed, and touch off the next charge early. He checks the vent, the small hole at the breech where fire eventually reaches the powder, clearing it with a fine wire so it doesn't clog with residue. And he inspects the truck carriage itself, greasing the axles, checking that the wheels still turn freely under 1.5 tons of iron, because a carriage that doesn't roll smoothly on recoil doesn't absorb the shock the way it's supposed to, and a carriage that doesn't absorb the shock properly is a carriage that eventually splits, or snaps its breeching rope, or worse. None of this is glamorous. All of it, Ned tells you flatly, is the actual difference between a gun that saves your life and one that ends it. There's a quarters bill posted near the companionway, a simple list, chalked and rechalked as men come and go, assigning every soul aboard a specific station for when the drum sounds, whether or not a fight is actually expected. You find your own name on it before Ned even points it out, listed under the same gun you've just been touring. And it's a strange feeling, seeing your role written down in someone else's careful hand before you've fired a single shot. Boys as young as 9 or 10 served aboard vessels of this era in exactly the running, fetching roles you'll come to know soon enough. Apprenticed into the sea trade the same way a boy on land might be apprenticed to a cooper or a blacksmith, except that a cooper's apprentice rarely stood 18 feet from several £1,000s of gunpowder on his very first week of work. The quarters bill doesn't care how old you are. It only cares that every gun has enough hands assigned to it to actually work. Ned pauses at the very last gun in the row, a stout little Saker with a name, actually painted, in faded letters, along its barrel, and grins for the first time since you came below. "That's Betsy," he says, without a hint of irony, and admits that half the guns on this deck have names nobody remembers the origin of anymore, inherited along with the gun itself from whatever crew owned her last. It's a small thing, mostly harmless, but it says something true about how these men related to the machines that kept them alive, not as cold iron, but as something closer to a difficult, temperamental crew member in its own right, one that needed tending, that occasionally misbehaved, and that everyone aboard had a personal stake in keeping in good working order. Salt air, Ned reminds you, is relentless. Iron left unattended for even a few weeks develops a fine reddish bloom of rust that, left longer, eats into the metal itself. Which is why every gun on this deck gets a regular coat of blacking, a tar and lamp-black mixture worked into the barrel by hand, less for appearance than for survival. A rusted gun is a gun that can burst rather than fire, and a burst gun takes its own crew with it. For now, though, walk the row with him one more time. 12 guns, maybe 14 if the captain's been lucky lately. None of them matching. All of them capable of turning a merchant ship's decision to fight back into the worst decision that captain ever made. This is the gun deck. This is where the pirate ship's actual power lived. Not in the black flag snapping overhead, which was, more often than not, theatre. The guns were the argument underneath the theatre. And in a few minutes, you're going to watch exactly how that argument got made. Not in a battle, but in the much more common, much quieter moment when a captain decided that a single shot, aimed carefully and fired once, was worth more than any battle at all. Ned's still talking as you leave the row of guns behind. Something about how a well-kept gun could outlast 3 crews, but a shout goes up from the deck above, and by the time you climb back into daylight, everyone's eyes are fixed on a sail on the horizon. What you're about to see wasn't the exception on a pirate cruise. It was, for many crews, most of what their guns were ever actually used for. It's the 3rd of April, 1719, somewhere off the coast of West Africa, and a merchant captain named William Snelgrave is standing on the deck of his ship, the Bird, watching a strange vessel close the distance with an unhurried confidence that makes his stomach drop before his mind has finished working out why. Snelgrave is a real historical figure, a slave ship captain who later wrote an account of what happened to him that survives to this day. One of the more detailed first-hand descriptions we have of exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a pirate's guns rather than behind them. This is his story, told the way he told it, with the understanding that a man writing about his own captivity years later is not a neutral narrator, but a witness all the same. The ship approaching flies no colours at all at first, which is itself a kind of warning. An honest merchantman announces herself. A pirate keeps you guessing as long as possible. Snelgrave has heard the rumours circulating up and down this stretch of coast for months. A loose confederation of pirate crews, several captains sailing in company, working the slave-trading ports of West Africa, where ships sat heavy with goods and light on the will to fight. He hasn't seen them yet. He's about to. Here's what happens next, and here's the thing that surprises almost everyone who assumes pirate battles looked like something out of an adventure film. Nothing happens for a long, agonizing stretch of nothing. The strange ship simply gains, and gains and gains, close enough now that Snelgrave can make out men crowding her rail, and then, almost as an afterthought, a shot. Not a broadside. One gun, one ball, fired not at the Bird's hull but skipping across the water ahead of her bow, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough to do no damage at all. This is called a shot across the bow, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most consequential single actions any gun crew on a pirate ship could take. Because everything after it depends on how the target responds. A shot across the bow means one thing and one thing only. Strike your colours, heave to, and this ends without anyone dying today. It costs the pirate crew almost nothing. 1 cartridge of powder, 1 ball, 30 seconds of a gun captain's attention, and it accomplishes, more often than any boarding action or exchange of full broadsides, the entire goal of the entire cruise. Merchant captains struck their colours to a shot across the bow constantly, and it's worth sitting with why. Because the answer isn't cowardice. It's arithmetic. A merchant crew of 12 sailors, armed with nothing but the ship's own small defensive battery, facing a pirate crew of 80 or 100 men who had chosen this life specifically because they were willing to fight for it. Backed by guns already run out and primed, that arithmetic almost never favoured resistance. Snelgrave, watching that single ball skip across the water ahead of his ship, understood the equation instantly. He did not strike his colours quickly enough for the pirate's taste. And that hesitation is what turned his capture into something considerably worse than it needed to be. The pirate ship, under a captain named Thomas Coughlin, sailing that season in loose company with 2 other pirate captains along that stretch of coast, didn't wait for a second polite warning. The next shots came in earnest, not skipping harmlessly across the water this time, but tearing into the Bird's rigging, and Snelgrave watched, according to his own later account, as his own crew's nerve broke entirely, some of them refusing outright to man the ship's few guns in her defence. Within minutes it was over. The pirates came aboard, and Snelgrave, a man used to giving orders on his own quarterdeck, was marched below at the point of a cutlass to meet the captain of the vessel that had just taken his ship, his cargo, and, for the moment, his entire fate out of his hands. What follows in his account is genuinely strange, and it's worth sitting with because it complicates the simple story people often tell about pirate cruelty. Snelgrave, by his own telling, was treated with a rough but real courtesy by several of the pirates who took him, offered food, given some protection from the crew members most eager to abuse him, and eventually released along with a portion of his ship once the pirates had stripped what they wanted. This wasn't universal kindness. It was, in part, self-interest. Captured captains who could later testify that pirates had treated them decently made piracy marginally more survivable for everyone the next crew captured. And some pirate captains understood that reputation, cultivated carefully, was itself a kind of weapon. A merchant captain who expected brutal treatment fought harder. A merchant captain who'd heard pirates sometimes let you keep your life, and a share of your goods struck his colours faster. The guns did the threatening, the stories did the rest. It's worth pausing here on the flag itself, because it's doing exactly as much work in this story as any gun. The vessel that ran down on Snelgrave that morning would almost certainly have raised a black flag at some point before that first warning shot. Not the skull and crossbones of later popular imagination in every case, but some variation of it. A red or black banner meant to communicate a very specific message before a single word was exchanged between the two ships. A black flag, broadly, meant surrender now and you may yet be shown mercy. A red flag, flown by some crews in place of or alongside the black, carried a harder promise. No quarter would be given at all, to anyone, regardless of what they did next. The flag was, in effect, the opening move of a negotiation conducted almost entirely through symbols and warning shots, rather than words, and a merchant captain who understood the difference between the two banners understood, in that instant, exactly how much room he had left to make a decision. Snelgrave, by his own account, had time to register the colours before the guns ever spoke. Whether that registration came fast enough is precisely the question his hesitation left unanswered. Not every captain facing that same calculation chose the way Snelgrave eventually did. Merchant accounts from across the Golden Age describe no shortage of captains who chose to fight rather than strike, sometimes successfully, more often not. A well-armed merchantman with a disciplined crew and a captain willing to risk everything could, occasionally, drive off a pirate vessel entirely, particularly if the pirate crew judged the potential cost not worth a cargo that might turn out to be worthless anyway. But the more common outcome, documented again and again in the depositions merchant captains gave to colonial authorities after the fact, was considerably grimmer. Crews that resisted and lost were treated, on average, far more harshly than crews that struck their colours promptly, a pattern pirate captains cultivated quite deliberately, because a reputation for punishing resistance made the next ship's decision to surrender that much easier. It's an ugly kind of logic, but it's also, in its own way, exactly the same logic behind that single warning shot fired across Snelgrave's bow. Cheaper, in the long run, to make the threat credible than to have to prove it over and over again at the cost of a real fight. Here's what's easy to miss in a story like Snelgrave's. The gun that actually mattered most that day wasn't the broadside that tore into his rigging. It was the single warning shot fired first, the one that cost almost nothing, and was meant to end the entire encounter before it began. Across the whole of the Golden Age of Piracy, historians estimate the overwhelming majority of ships taken by pirate crews surrendered without a full engagement ever developing. Some estimates put it well above 9 encounters out of every 10. The cannon deck's real job, most days, wasn't destruction. It was persuasion, delivered at the range of a single well-placed ball. by men who'd rather not fight a battle they didn't strictly need to win twice. The vessel that took Snelgrave wasn't sailing entirely alone either, and understanding why matters for grasping how much force a captain like Cochrane could actually project along this coast. Pirate captains of this era frequently sailed in loose, informal partnerships with one or two other crews, an arrangement historians call consorting, not a permanent fleet under single command, but a temporary alliance of convenience, useful for overwhelming larger or better defended targets, sharing intelligence about which ports and which captains to avoid, and simply enjoying company and a shared anchorage between cruises. Around the same season Snelgrave was taken, Cochrane is documented sailing in loose company, with two other notable captains working the same stretch of West African coast, their combined crews numbering well into the hundreds when anchored together. It's a far cry from the popular image of a single lone ship prowling the seas, and it explains why a stretch of coastline could feel, to merchant captains working it, less like open water and more like territory genuinely controlled by an alliance no single navy patrol could easily dislodge. Word of an encounter like Snelgrave's didn't stay contained to the two ships involved, either. Merchant captains working the same stretch of coast talked constantly, trading news whenever their paths crossed in port or at anchor, and a captured captain's account of how he'd been treated, well or badly, travelled up and down the shipping lanes almost as fast as the pirates themselves did. This is exactly how a name like Thomas Cochrane's came to carry real weight before most of the captains who feared him had ever laid eyes on his ship, not through any official record, but through the accumulated, second-hand testimony of men who'd heard it from other men who'd been there. A merchant captain approaching an unfamiliar sail off this coast wasn't making his decision about whether to fight or strike his colours in a vacuum. He was making it with months of half-reliable rumour already rattling around in his head, shaped by every account he'd ever heard, true or exaggerated, of what happened to the last ship that guessed wrong. Snelgrave's own cargo complicates his story in a way worth sitting with honestly rather than glossing over. The Bird, like La Concorde in a different corner of this same trade a few years later, was a slave ship, and the human beings held captive in her hold when the pirates came aboard remained, throughout the entire encounter, entirely without agency in a situation already defined by violence and coercion on every side. Some pirate crews of this era are documented incorporating captured Africans directly into their own ranks, occasionally as full crew members entitled to a share under the ship's articles. Others simply treated them as one more form of cargo to be sold onward. Neither outcome undoes the horror of the system that put them in that hold in the first place. It's a detail the era's own participants rarely lingered on in their own accounts, Snelgrave included. And it's worth noticing exactly that silence for what it is. Snelgrave himself was eventually released, along with a portion of his ship, weeks after his capture, and he went on to complete several more voyages in the slave trade before retiring and, years later, publishing the account that preserved this entire episode for anyone to read centuries afterward. It's worth remembering, reading his description of a shot across the bow or a captain's rough courtesy, that he wrote it as a man looking back from safety, shaping his own captivity into a coherent narrative, the way anyone eventually does, with the frightening things that happen to them. That doesn't make the underlying details unreliable, particularly the ones corroborated elsewhere in the record, but it's a useful reminder of something true about nearly every first-hand pirate account that survives from this era. The people who lived to write these stories down were, almost by definition, the ones for whom the story ended relatively well. The men who didn't survive their own encounters with a gun deck like this one left no memoir behind at all. Before Cochrane's gunners ever touched a slow match to that first warning shot, someone aboard would have spent several minutes simply watching the Bird through a glass, reading her the way an experienced hand learns to read any potential target. How she rode in the water, how quickly or slowly her crew moved about the deck, whether her gun ports, if she had any worth mentioning, showed any sign of being manned at all. A merchantman riding low and heavy in the water suggested a full, valuable cargo worth the risk of pursuit. One moving oddly slow for the wind suggested undermanning, or damage, or simple bad seamanship, any of which made her a softer target. This kind of reading happened before a single shot was fired, shaping the entire approach. And it's part of why the warning shot itself so rarely came as a genuine surprise to the men firing it. By the time Coughlin's gun captain touched fire to priming powder that morning, he already had a fairly confident guess about how the next several minutes were likely to unfold. That doesn't mean the guns sat idle the rest of the time. Some captains resisted. Some crews, backed into a corner or protecting cargo valuable enough to risk everything, fought back anyway. And when that happened, when a shot across the bow wasn't enough, when a merchant captain like the one Snellgrave might have been on a different, braver day chose to run out his own guns instead of striking his colours, the gun deck stopped being a threat and became, very quickly, a machine. That machine is what we're climbing back down into next, and this time nobody down there is going to be standing around explaining the guns to you calmly. This time, the drum is beating, the deck is clearing, and you have about 4 minutes to get every single step right, or you don't get a second chance to get it wrong. Snellgrave lived to write his account down, which puts him among the fortunate. Not every crew on either side of an engagement like his got to walk away and tell the story afterward. And the difference, more often than anything else, came down to what happened in the next few minutes below decks once a fight actually started. Let's go see it. The drum starts before you're even fully awake. And that's not a figure of speech. You genuinely surface out of a doze in your hammock to the sound of it. A hard, urgent rhythm that every man aboard has been trained, sometimes at the end of a rope's end during drills, to associate with exactly one thing: guns. Now, you hit the deck running, quite literally, bare feet slapping wet planking, and the ship around you transforms in a way that still catches you off guard, even though you've drilled this a dozen times. Furniture gets struck below. Bulkheads that normally divide the deck into cabins get unhooked and hauled away entirely, opening the whole gun deck into one long, uninterrupted space, because nothing gets to slow down the movement of powder, shot, and men once the guns start working. This is called clearing for action, and a well-drilled crew can do it in under 10 minutes. You are, this morning, discovering exactly how much of that 10 minutes is actually usable, and how much of it disappears just getting your own head clear. By the time you reach your assigned gun, a demi-culverin near midships, the same one Ned walked you past that first day below, the crew is already forming around it, and you realize with a jolt that you have a job now. A specific one, and that job is sponging. Ned, it turns out, is your gun captain, and the first thing he does is put a hand flat on your chest and hold it there for 1 full second. Breathe, he says. You've got time. You never have time. But you've got time. It's not really advice. It's a ritual, something he says to every green hand on their first action. And it works about as well as such things ever work, which is to say not very well at all, but enough. 2 guns down, you catch sight of a crew clearly having a rougher morning than yours, a knot of men shouting over each other, a rammer jammed halfway down a barrel, a gun captain barking the same order twice before anyone actually moves. Not every crew aboard this ship has a Ned standing at its center. And it shows, instantly, in exactly the moment where it matters most. What happens to a gun crew that falls too far behind the rhythm of the fight is a story for a little later, There's a version of that morning where things go very differently for the men on that gun, and we'll get to it. But for now, your own attention snaps back to your own barrel, because Ned's voice is already cutting through the noise, steady as ever, walking you into the next step before you've fully finished the last one. Here is the sequence, and you will run through it, if today goes long, as many as 15 or 20 times before it's over, each cycle taking a well-drilled crew somewhere between 90 seconds and 2 full minutes. Faster for a crack gun crew, slower for one still finding its rhythm, which tonight, unfortunately, is you. First, after the gun fires and lurches backward on its carriage against the groaning, breaching rope, you drive a sponge, a wet sheepskin bundle on the end of a long pole, down the barrel, twisting it to snuff out any lingering embers from the last shot. Skip this step, or rush it, and the next load of powder you introduce can ignite prematurely, against the muzzle, against your own hands. This has happened. It is exactly as bad as it sounds, and it's precisely why Ned watches your sponge work with an intensity that borders on obsessive. Next comes the cartridge, powder pre-measured into a canvas or paper bag, rammed home with the same long pole, now fitted with a rammer head instead of a sponge. A wad goes in behind it to hold it snug against the breech. Then the shot itself, a solid iron ball for most work. Though you'll learn today that a captain choosing to disable rigging rather than sink a ship might call for chain shot instead. 2 half balls linked by a length of chain that spins wickedly through the air and shreds sail and cordage like a scythe through wheat. Another wad on top, rammed home to keep the ball from rolling back out of the barrel as it's angled. Then the gun is run out, hauled forward on its trucks by main strength until the muzzle clears the gun port, 4 or 5 men heaving on tackle for a gun that, fully loaded, might weigh close to 1.5 tons. A gun this size doesn't run on one pair of hands, and by your second shot, you've finally sorted out who's who around you. 6 or 7 men to a piece, each with a job that never changes no matter how tired anyone gets. There's the gun captain, Ned, who aims and gives the order to fire and nothing else, because that decision needs one clear head making it, and no others. There's the spongers and loaders, you among them, who never touch the firing mechanism at all. There's a man permanently stationed at the tackle, hauling the gun back out after every recoil, and there's Tom, or a boy exactly like him, running the powder up from below, on a schedule that never quite lines up with how fast you'd like it to. By your third shot, roughly 3 minutes into the engagement, the whole crew has fallen into something close to rhythm. Not smooth, not yet, but recognizable. The kind of shared motion that 6 strangers pressed into the same desperate job for the first time somehow manage to find if nobody panics and nobody stops moving. Somewhere in the middle of all this, a wire goes down the touch hole at the breech to pierce the cartridge bag inside, and fine priming powder gets poured into the touch hole itself. A slow match, a length of cord soaked in a saltpeter solution, kept burning in a covered tub of sand nearby specifically so no open flame ever touches bare deck, gets touched to the priming powder, and the gun fires. The recoil, when it comes, is the single most dangerous half-second of the entire cycle. That breaching rope Ned showed you your first day, snug and unremarkable then, is now the only thing keeping this gun from careening backward across the deck, with enough force to crush anyone standing behind it. You've heard the stories. Everyone has. A snapped breaching rope on a first-rate warship, decades later, would kill and maim so many men in a single incident that the phrase loose cannon entered the English language permanently because of it. And though that particular famous account comes from a novel rather than a documented naval record, the danger it describes was entirely real, and every gun crew on every armed vessel of this era, pirate or otherwise, knew it in their bones. Ned checks that rope between every single shot. Every single one. It's the least glamorous, most important job on the entire gun crew, and it belongs, this morning, to a boy who can't be older than 11. His name is Tom, and he's what's called a powder monkey. Small, quick, and tasked with running fresh cartridges up from the powder room below to the guns, again and again, for as long as the action lasts. He's not a documented historical figure with a name in any surviving record. Boys like him rarely got individual mention unless something remarkable happened to them, which is itself a kind of quiet tragedy worth sitting with. But boys exactly like him were absolutely, extensively documented as a category. Young, expendable in the eyes of the men running the ship, chosen specifically for their size because a smaller target moving fast through a crowded gun deck was less likely to catch a splinter or a stray shot than a grown man doing the same job. Tom's been aboard 8 months. He signed the ship's articles, same as everyone else, which meant he was entitled to a share of any prize taken, small as it was. A detail that meant something to him, Ned mentions between shots, because Tom talks constantly about what he'll do with his cut once they make port. He's got a specific number in mind. He tells anyone who'll listen. By your 4th shot, roughly 6 minutes into the engagement, if anyone were counting, which nobody has time to do, your arms are burning in a way you didn't know arms could burn, and the deck is thick with a rolling grey smoke that makes the far end of your own gun barely visible. This is normal. This is what every naval engagement of the period actually looked like, from the inside. Not the clean, wide shots of a painting, but a fog bank of your own making, thick enough that gun crews sometimes fired at muzzle flashes rather than visible targets, thick enough that men lost track of which way was forward. Sound becomes the only reliable sense, the deep concussive crack of your own gun, the higher whine of shot passing overhead, and underneath all of it, Ned's voice, steady and almost bored-sounding, walking you through each step again and again. Because a calm voice, it turns out, does more work in a fight than any amount of courage. By your 6th shot, something else has started happening that nobody warned you about. And it isn't dramatic enough to have a name the way the smoke or the recoil does. Your hearing has gone strange, muffled on one side, ringing high and thin on the other, every sound arriving as though it's travelling through water. This isn't unusual, and it isn't temporary for everyone. Gunners across the entire age of sail were documented, again and again, developing permanent hearing loss from exactly this kind of repeated close-range concussion, an occupational injury nobody at the time had a word for beyond simply going deaf young. Ned, you notice now that you're paying attention, leans his head slightly when spoken to, favouring one ear over the other in a way that's clearly long practiced rather than new. It's not the kind of wound that gets a payout under the ship's articles the way a lost arm might. It just accumulates, quietly, shot after shot, year after year, until a man in his 30s can barely hear a normal conversation at all. Nobody down here makes a joke about it. There isn't one worth making. Ned calls for chain shot on your 5th loading, and the whole rhythm of the gun changes for a moment while you fumble with the unfamiliar shape of it, 2 half-balls linked by a short length of chain, awkward to ram compared to a clean round shot, prone to catching if you rush it. The target this morning, you gather from the shouted orders passing down the deck, isn't meant to be sunk, and a captain who wants a prize intact rather than at the bottom of the ocean chooses his ammunition accordingly. Round shot punches holes in a hull. Chain shot, fired at rigging and masts rather than the hull itself, spins wickedly through the air on release, tearing through sail canvas and shredding standing rigging, aiming to cripple a ship's ability to run rather than to kill the men aboard her or damage the cargo everyone actually wants intact. It's a small, telling choice. This switch from round to chain. And it tells you something about what tonight's fight is actually for. Nobody wants a prize they can't sail home. That rougher crew 2 guns down, it turns out, gets its reckoning around the same time as your 6th shot. A flash burn across one man's hands and forearms when the rammer jams and the gun fires a half-second before he's fully clear. The kind of injury that happens exactly as often as you'd expect on a crew that never quite found its rhythm. It isn't fatal. It isn't even, by the standards of what you'll learn below decks a little later tonight, especially severe. But the man goes quiet and grey-faced, cradling his arms against his chest, and gets walked below by the crewmate beside him well before the engagement's over. A small mercy and a small warning both at once. The difference between his morning and yours came down to nothing more mysterious than one gun captain who'd done this 100 times and one who perhaps hadn't done it quite as many. By the time the enemy ship strikes her colours, roughly 9 minutes after the first shot, by Ned's later estimate, though nobody was checking a watch, you've fired your gun 11 times, and your hands are shaking in a way that has nothing to do with the cold. Tom comes up from below one final time, breathless, grinning in a way that's entirely inappropriate for the moment and entirely understandable given he's still alive, and Ned actually laughs, a short, surprised bark of a sound, and cuffs the boy lightly on the shoulder. It's a small moment. It shouldn't mean as much as it does. But down here, in the smoke and the ringing silence after 11 shots, a small kindness between 2 people who've just survived the same 11 minutes together is worth more than almost anything else this ship carries. Standing down from action turns out to have its own quiet ritual, every bit as deliberate as clearing, for it did. Ned walks the gun through one final cycle. Sponge, but no cartridge behind it this time. Just cold water to douse anything still smouldering deep in the barrel, before easing her back from the gun port and lashing the breeching rope snug against the roll of the ship. The tompion goes back into the muzzle. The gun port lid swings shut and latches. Somewhere down the row, other gun captains are doing exactly the same thing. Guns falling quiet one by one in a ragged, unofficial rhythm that has nothing to do with any order and everything to do with each crew simply finishing its own work at its own pace. It's strangely anticlimactic after everything that just happened, and that, Ned tells you later, is rather the point. A gun crew that treats the end of a fight with the same careful attention as the start of one is a crew that's still in one piece to fight the next time it matters. What you don't yet know, standing there with your arms shaking and the smoke starting to clear, is how close that gun crew came, on its 7th shot, to something going badly wrong. A smouldering ember in the barrel that Ned caught, with an extra beat of the sponge nobody else noticed him take. We'll come back to what happens when that kind of moment doesn't get caught in time. For now, the guns have gone quiet, the enemy's boarded, and the only thing left to do is climb back down into the one part of the ship where all of this power actually comes from in the first place. The powder room, one deck below where you're standing, where a different kind of danger lives permanently, whether the guns are firing or not. The smoke clears slowly, drifting up through the gratings toward open air, but somewhere below your feet, in a small locked room forward of the hold, none of that relief applies. Down there, the danger never really stops for the day. It just waits. You have to take your shoes off before you go in. That's the rule. And it isn't optional. And the man enforcing it, a broad, unhurried figure everyone aboard calls Gunner Hollis. Because that is, quite literally, his job title as well as how the crew addresses him, checks your feet personally before he lets you past the canvas curtain into the magazine. Felt slippers only, kept just inside the entrance for exactly this purpose, because a single spark struck from a hobnail or an iron buckle against the wrong surface, down here, doesn't start a fire. It ends a ship. The powder room or magazine sits low and forward in the hull, below the waterline where it's protected from enemy shot and, just as importantly, kept as cool and dry as a wooden ship afloat in salt water can manage. Gunnar Hollis has spent 11 years learning exactly how much that isn't very cool or very dry at all. And it's a fight he wages constantly. Damp powder doesn't explode. It clumps. It fails. It turns a loaded gun into a very expensive, very heavy piece of useless furniture at precisely the wrong moment. So the barrels are wrapped, stored raised off the deck on wooden battens to keep bilge water from creeping up into them, and checked by hand, Hollis running dry fingers through a sample from each new barrel, the way a baker tests flour. The room itself is lined with copper sheeting rather than bare iron nails, and every tool inside it, scoops, funnels, the small tubs used to measure out cartridge charges, is made of copper or brass rather than iron, for the same reason your shoes stayed outside the curtain. Iron striking iron makes sparks. Copper striking copper, or copper striking anything, essentially doesn't, or at least not with anywhere near the same reliability. It's a small design choice that shows up, quietly, in nearly every serious magazine of the era, on pirate ships and naval ships alike. And it tells you something about how seriously this specific danger was taken by people who had absolutely nothing else in common, hardened criminals, and His Majesty's commissioned officers, agreeing completely on exactly one thing. There's a single lantern allowed near the magazine, and even that comes with its own elaborate workaround, a light room, a tiny separate compartment sealed off from the powder itself by a thick pane of glass, so the flame illuminates the magazine through the window without ever actually sharing air with it. No candle, no open flame, no pipe. Smoking anywhere near this room is, on most pirate ships operating under written articles, a serious offence, sometimes punished severely. Because a single careless spark here doesn't threaten one man's life. It threatens everyone's, all at once, with no warning at all. Magazine explosions were a documented, recurring horror of the age of sail. Ships across the era were lost entirely to sudden detonations, traced back to exactly this kind of carelessness. A dropped lantern, a spark from an iron tool, powder dust ignited by nothing more than friction and bad luck. When it happened in an instant. There was rarely anyone left afterward to explain precisely how. Hollis measures out cartridges by hand for today's action, working with the calm, repetitive precision of a man who has done this exact motion perhaps 10,000 times in his career, and has, so far, survived every single one of them. Each cartridge, canvas or heavy paper tied off at one end, gets filled with a specific measured charge, depending on which gun it's destined for, because too little powder undercharges the shot and leaves it falling short, while too much risks a burst barrel that can kill the entire gun crew standing around it faster and more completely than any enemy shot ever could. Gunpowder itself, in this period, is a specific and somewhat fussy mixture, roughly 3/4 saltpeter, the rest split between charcoal and sulfur. And the exact ratio and grain size actually matters enormously to how reliably and how powerfully it burns. A cheap, poorly made batch, bought hastily or taken as plunder from a prize with no way to verify its quality, could fail entirely at the worst possible moment, or worse, burn unevenly and crack a barrel that had fired reliably 100 times before. Hollis has his own way of testing a new barrel's quality before he'll trust it near a gun, and it's simpler than you'd expect from a man this careful about everything else. A small pinch, set a light on a metal plate outside the magazine curtain, well clear of any other stores. Good powder, he explains, flashes and burns clean, leaving almost nothing behind. A bright, fast, near total consumption of the sample. Poor powder, adulterated or damp or simply badly made, burns slower, leaves a scorched residue, sometimes fails to catch at all on the first attempt. It's not a scientific instrument by any modern measure, but it's reliable enough, tested against enough barrels over enough years, that Hollis trusts his own eyes and nose over a merchant's assurance every single time. A barrel that fails his little test gets set aside, used for the ship's least critical purposes, or simply jettisoned rather than risked in a gun during an actual engagement. Because the alternative, discovering a bad batch mid-battle, when a gun simply fails to fire at the worst possible moment, is a risk none of these men are willing to run twice. The powder itself has to come from somewhere, and here the story of the gun deck reaches back much further than any single ship or captain. Saltpeter, the dominant ingredient in the mixture, was in this period sourced overwhelmingly from India, where it occurred naturally in soil deposits and was harvested, refined, and shipped in enormous quantities by the English and Dutch East India companies to feed the gunpowder mills of Europe. Every cartridge Hollis measures out tonight, in other words, carries inside it the tail end of a supply chain that stretched literally around the globe. Dug from Indian soil, shipped to European ports, refined and mixed and packed into barrels, sold or stolen or captured, and eventually loaded onto a ship that had no legal right to any of it at all. Sulfur, the second ingredient, often came from volcanic deposits around Sicily and other parts of the Mediterranean, while charcoal, the third, was typically burned locally from specific woods. Willow and alder favored for their particular burning properties. A pirate crew rarely thought about any of this directly, but the powder in Hollis's careful hands connected this small, dark, dangerous room to trade routes spanning 3 continents, whether anyone aboard ever gave it a second thought or not. Powder was also, in its own quiet way, one of the most valuable things aboard any pirate ship, and Hollis guards the stores the way another man might guard actual coin, because in practice, it functioned almost like currency. A ship running low on good dry powder was a ship with drastically reduced options. Couldn't threaten effectively. Couldn't fight if threatening failed. Couldn't even fire the customary celebratory volleys that pirate crews sometimes used to intimidate a port or announce their own arrival with theatrical menace. Capturing a prize loaded with quality powder was, for many crews, every bit as valuable a prize as capturing one loaded with coin or trade goods, and captains are documented prioritizing powder and shot specifically when dividing up what a captured vessel actually carried. Rationing is a constant, quiet calculation, running underneath everything else Hollis does, especially on a long cruise far from any friendly port, where more powder might be bought or taken. A captain planning a voyage of several months has to weigh how much of the ship's limited cargo space gets given over to powder and shot against every other need aboard: food, water, trade goods, room for the crew itself. And Hollis is the one who ultimately has to make that supply stretch. Engagement after engagement, without ever quite knowing how many fights still lie ahead. He keeps a running tally, chalked on a slate kept just inside the magazine curtain, updated after every action, and he's not shy about telling a captain plainly when the stores are running thin enough that the next encounter needs to end with a shot across the bow rather than a drawn-out exchange. It's an unglamorous kind of authority, quietly overruling a captain's more aggressive instincts, with nothing more than a chalked number on a slate. But more than one crew's survival across a long cruise came down to exactly this kind of discipline, exercised by a man most of the crew barely noticed until the day the powder ran dangerously low. There's a particular kind of quiet down here that you don't find anywhere else on the ship, and it takes you a while standing beside Hollis to understand why. Up top, danger announces itself. A sail on the horizon, a shot fired, a fight you can see coming and brace for. Down here, danger is just always present, silent, requiring nothing more than a single mistake to turn from nothing at all into everything at once. Hollis has made his peace with that in a way that looks, from the outside, almost meditative. He moves slowly, checks everything twice without seeming to think about checking it, and talks in a low, even voice the entire time he's working, as though raising his voice near the powder might somehow matter, which it doesn't. Not physically, but the habit persists anyway. Old fears leave marks on a man's behavior long after the actual reasoning behind them fades. He tells you, without any particular drama in his voice, about a ship he served on years earlier that lost 11 men in an instant when a magazine went up during an engagement. No warning, no error anyone ever identified afterward. Just a flash, and then a hole in the world, where 11 specific people used to be standing. It's not clear, even now, exactly what went wrong that day, and Hollis doesn't pretend otherwise. Some things about magazine explosions of this era simply went undocumented, because the people best positioned to explain what happened were the same people who didn't survive it. He tells you this not to frighten you, particularly, but because it's simply true, and because the felt slippers by the curtain and the copper tools and the sealed lantern all exist for exactly one reason. Enough people learned this lesson the hard way that everyone still alive decided not to test it again. During an actual engagement, Hollis's own job narrows to something more physically confined than the constant walking inspection he performs on a quiet day. Once action starts, he stays fixed at the magazine curtain itself, handing measured cartridges out through a small scuttle to a chain of runners like Tom, rather than moving freely about the ship. Because leaving the powder unattended even briefly, with a battle underway and dozens of men moving fast and carelessly through every other part of the deck, is a risk no experienced gunner is willing to take. A gunner's mate, where a crew has one, usually takes over the walking inspection role during battle instead, checking each gun crew's discipline from the outside while Hollis holds his post at the source. It's a small division of labor easy to miss from up on deck, but it means that even in the noisiest, most chaotic minutes of a fight, someone is always standing exactly where the powder is, watching it, guarding it, making sure the one truly irreplaceable resource on the entire ship never becomes anyone's afterthought. Before Hollis will trust any gun with a full charge, he runs his thumb along a small stamped mark near the breech of each barrel, a proofing mark left behind by whichever foundry originally cast the piece, certifying that the gun had been test-fired at the factory with a deliberately overcharged load to confirm the metal could take the strain without bursting. A gun with no visible proofing mark, or one worn too smooth to read anymore, gets treated with extra suspicion, loaded a touch lighter than its rated charge until it's proven itself reliable through simple repeated use. It's a small piece of quality control inherited from an entirely different world. Foundries in England, France, and the Netherlands, run by craftsmen who never expected a single one of the guns leaving their workshops to end up serving a pirate crew. And it's a reminder that even the most lawless vessel afloat still depended, at the most basic physical level, on standards set by the very governments its crew had chosen to defy. Hollis also drills something into every new hand who works near a gun that has nothing to do with loading procedure at all, where to stand and where never to stand, relative to the touch hole the instant before firing. A flash of hot gas and burning residue can vent backward through that small opening at the moment of ignition, and a man leaning too close or standing directly behind it risks a burn to the face or hands that costs him nothing structurally, but leaves a mark, sometimes a lasting one, for the rest of his life. Ned turns his own head aside and angles his body slightly out of line every single time he touches the slow match to the priming powder, a habit so deeply worn into him by now that he does it without appearing to think about it at all. The same unconscious flinch that isn't quite a flinch that marks every experienced gunner on every deck of this era, pirate or otherwise. Hollis wasn't always the one holding this particular job, and he's frank about how he got here when you ask. Gunners of this era typically rose through years of practical experience rather than any formal schooling, working first as ordinary hands on a gun crew, then as a gunner's mate assisting whoever held the senior post before them, gradually accumulating the specific, hard-won knowledge, how much charge a given gun could safely take, how a particular barrel of powder from a particular captured prize actually performed, which knots and which tools genuinely mattered, and which were just habit, that eventually made a crew willing to trust their lives to his judgment. On a Royal Navy warship, gunner was a formally warranted position with defined pay and defined responsibility. Aboard a pirate ship operating under its own written articles, the role carried real authority all the same. Sometimes an extra share of any prize taken in recognition of exactly how much the entire crew's safety depended on this one man getting his work right, every single time, without exception, for as long as he held the post. By the time you leave the magazine, ducking back out under the canvas curtain and lacing your boots back on, the ship above has gone back to something like normal rhythm, men coiling rope, mending sail, the ordinary business of staying afloat that makes up the overwhelming majority of any voyage, pirate or otherwise. But you carry something out of that small, dark room with you that doesn't quite leave. A different kind of respect, maybe, for the quiet, unglamorous discipline that kept 100 men alive around several £1,000s of something that wanted, with very little encouragement, to end all of them at once. The powder held today. It doesn't always. Sometimes the danger that lives quietly in that dark room finds its way up onto the open deck instead, not through an explosion, but through the far more common and far more personal violence of a broadside actually landing. That's where we're headed next, and it's the part of the gundeck story that the paintings and the legends tend to leave out entirely. The 10th of February, 1722, dawns grey and close off the coast of what is now Gabon, and aboard a ship called the Royal Fortune, a man named Bartholomew Roberts is eating breakfast, a plate of salmagundi, by the account later given by the surgeon aboard the vessel hunting him, a fittingly ordinary meal for what is about to become one of the most consequential mornings in the entire history of Atlantic piracy. Roberts, by 1722, is arguably the most successful pirate captain of the entire Golden Age, credited with taking somewhere between 200 and 400 vessels over a career of roughly 3 years. Dressed, by multiple accounts, in a crimson waistcoat and a hat with a red feather whenever action was expected. Because Roberts understood something about theatre that most of his contemporaries only half grasped. He is about to learn, in the space of a few minutes, that theatre has limits the guns don't. The ship closing on him is His Majesty's Ship Swallow, a 50-gun warship commanded by Captain Challoner Ogle, part of a Royal Navy squadron specifically dispatched to hunt Roberts down after his raids along the West African coast had grown too costly for the trading companies to ignore any longer. Aboard the Swallow, working as ship's surgeon, is a man named John Atkins, who will later publish his own account of this voyage, a documented primary source written by someone who was actually there, rather than a second-hand retelling assembled years afterward, and it's largely through his eyes, alongside surviving trial records, that we know what happened next. Roberts himself never set out to become any of this. Born in Wales and working, by 1719, as second mate aboard a merchant slave ship, he was captured off the coast of West Africa by a pirate crew under a captain named Howell Davis, and given the same stark choice that would later face so many men aboard his own vessel, join or be left behind with little guarantee of survival either way. He joined reluctantly, by most surviving accounts, an experienced navigator swept into a trade he hadn't chosen. And then, within a matter of weeks, following Davis's death in an ambush, was voted captain by the very crew that had forced him into piracy in the first place. Chosen specifically for the navigational skill that made him valuable regardless of how he'd come aboard. It's worth sitting with that irony for a moment. The man who would go on to become the most successful pirate captain of the entire Golden Age began his career as exactly the kind of pressed, unwilling hand you learned about several chapters ago. Elevated to command not through ambition, but through the same democratic vote for captain system that governed every other part of a pirate crew's life together. To understand what was actually at stake that morning, it helps to know what Roberts had already built by the time the Swallow appeared on his horizon. 3 years earlier, off the coast of Brazil in 1719, Roberts and his crew had pulled off one of the single most lucrative captures of the entire Golden Age, cutting a heavily laden Portuguese vessel out from the middle of a 42-ship treasure fleet anchored at the Bay of All Saints, taking her with a combination of nerve and audacity that left the rest of the fleet guarded by 2 Portuguese warships, too slow to respond before Roberts was already gone. Aboard her, by documented account, was a fortune in sugar, tobacco, and gold, along with a jeweled cross reportedly intended as a gift for the King of Portugal himself. It's the kind of single prize that could set an entire crew up for life, if any of them had been the type to walk away once they had it. And this detail matters, because none of them were. Roberts kept sailing, kept taking prizes, and by the time Challoner Ogle's squadron finally caught up with him, his reputation alone was worth more to the Royal Navy than almost any other pirate captain then still active on either side of the Atlantic. The Swallow's approach that morning was itself a small piece of naval theatre in its own right. Ogle, sighting Roberts's ships at anchor near Cape Lopez, deliberately turned away and sailed off as though retreating, a calculated maneuver meant to draw one of Roberts's 2 vessels, a smaller consort called the Ranger, out in pursuit, separating her from the Royal Fortune before turning to engage her alone, well out of supporting range of Roberts's main firepower. It worked exactly as intended. The Ranger, badly outgunned once the trap became clear, was forced to strike her colours after a running fight, and Ogle then turned the Swallow back toward Cape Lopez to deal with Roberts himself, still apparently unaware that his consort had already been picked off. It's a reminder that the guns you've spent tonight learning to load were only ever half of any real naval engagement. The other half was exactly this kind of patient, deceptive positioning, deciding the shape of the fight long before a single cartridge was ever rammed home. Roberts, according to these accounts, was caught genuinely off guard, his lookouts having misidentified the approaching Swallow as a merchant vessel rather than a naval warship, a mistake that cost him the single greatest advantage any pirate captain could hope for in this kind of engagement: the choice of whether to fight at all. By the time the mistake became clear, the Swallow was already closing fast, and Roberts, rather than attempting to flee outright, made the decision to run past her. A bold, characteristically aggressive maneuver meant to slip by close enough to exchange a devastating broadside and then outrun pursuit downwind, using the Royal Fortune's speed to escape after inflicting maximum damage. It very nearly worked. What it required, though, was for Roberts's own gun crews to execute a full broadside, every gun on one side of the ship, loaded, run out, and fired in a single coordinated volley, with the same precision you practiced, 1 gun at a time, back on your own quieter morning. On a ship the size of the Royal Fortune, that meant a dozen or more separate gun crews, each cycling through the exact sequence you learned: sponge, cartridge, wad, shot, wad, run out, prime, fire, in careful coordination with each other, so the entire broadside landed at once, rather than trickling out gun by gun and losing its concentrated shock. It is, even for a well-drilled crew, an enormously difficult thing to do correctly, and accounts of the engagement suggest Roberts's crew, some of them freshly pressed men with limited gunnery experience, did not manage it as cleanly as they needed to. It's worth understanding exactly what grapeshot was, since it's the specific kind of fire that ended Roberts's life in the account most historians treat as reliable. Rather than a single solid ball, a grape-shot charge packed a canvas bag or wooden frame with a cluster of smaller iron balls, sometimes a dozen or more, that scattered outward in a widening cone the moment the gun fired. Devastatingly effective against exposed men on an open deck, and largely useless against a hull. Which is exactly why a gun crew choosing between round shot and grape shot was, in effect, choosing between damaging a ship and killing the men standing on it. The Swallow's gunners, in the opening moments of the engagement, appear to have made precisely that choice. And Roberts, standing exposed on his own quarterdeck exactly where a captain giving orders in the middle of a fight needed to stand, paid the price for it, almost instantly. What we know with reasonable confidence, drawn from documented accounts closer to the actual event rather than the more colourful and less reliable retellings that circulated afterward, is this. Early in the exchange of fire, Roberts was killed on his own quarterdeck, struck in the throat by grape shot. A charge of small iron fragments fired from one of the Swallow's guns, specifically designed to scythe through exposed men on an open deck rather than punch through a hull. It's worth pausing on the source of that specific, grim detail. Much of the popular retelling of Roberts' final moments traces back to accounts published in the years immediately following, some drawing on testimony from officers aboard the Swallow, others embellished considerably in the retelling for a reading public hungry for a dramatic ending. The essential fact that Roberts died almost instantly, early in the engagement, struck down by the very kind of gunfire he'd spent 3 years dealing out to others, appears consistently enough across multiple sources to be treated as solidly documented. The precise poetic detail of exactly which gun, fired by which man, killed him is considerably less certain, and probably always will be. What happened next, though, is very well documented indeed, because it produced one of the most extensive surviving legal records of the entire pirate era. With their captain dead, Roberts's crew, according to the ship's articles that governed them, articles that Roberts himself had helped draft and that specified his body should be committed to the sea rather than left for an enemy to display, wrapped him, still in that crimson waistcoat, and dropped him over the side, waited, rather than let the Swallow's crew take his corpse as a trophy. It was, in its own strange way, a final act of loyalty from a crew that fought on, disorganized and leaderless for a short while longer before ultimately surrendering. Roughly 270 men were taken prisoner in the aftermath, and the majority of them were transported to Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast, where one of the largest formal piracy trials of the era took place over the following weeks. The surviving trial records, sworn testimony, cross-examinations, verdicts, represent an unusually rich and unusually reliable window into the actual composition of a pirate crew of this size. Far more trustworthy than the romanticized biographies published for entertainment around the same period. What they reveal is sobering. Dozens of the men aboard, including some quite young, testified they had been forced into piracy against their will, pressed from captured vessels and given the stark choice of signing the ship's articles or facing violence, sometimes death, for refusing. The court, weighing each case individually rather than treating the crew as a single undifferentiated mass of criminals, ultimately acquitted a meaningful number of these men on exactly those grounds, while the majority, somewhere in the range of 50 men, according to the surviving records, were convicted and hanged, their bodies in several cases displayed publicly along the coast as a deterrent to others. The men who stood trial at Cape Coast Castle ranged, according to the surviving records, from hardened veterans of the trade to boys barely into their teens who could offer little more in their own defense than the simple, verifiable fact that they'd been aboard only a matter of days or weeks before the Swallow appeared. The court's willingness to weigh these cases individually rather than condemning the entire crew as a single body produced outcomes that varied enormously from man to man standing in front of the same judges for the same alleged crime. A detail that complicates any simple story about how piracy trials of this era actually functioned. Some of the youngest and most clearly coerced were acquitted outright. Others, judged to have joined willingly, or to have taken an active role in violence against captured ships, were not shown the same leniency. It's a messier, more human picture than the flat popular image of pirate crews as uniformly villainous men who deserved whatever came to them, and it's precisely the kind of nuance that a documented trial record preserves and a romanticized retelling almost always flattens away. It's worth sitting, for a moment, with what those trial records actually reveal about the guns you've spent tonight learning to load and fire. Several of the men who testified had served specifically as gunners or members of gun crews, and their testimony describes, in plain, unromantic language, exactly the kind of drilled, repetitive, dangerous labor you experienced a few chapters ago. Not glorious battle, mostly, but grinding routine, punctuated by occasional terror. One of the details that surfaces repeatedly across the trial testimony is how genuinely divided these crews often were. Men who had joined willingly and enthusiastically standing gun to gun, with men who had been forced aboard at cutlass point and desperately wanted nothing more than to go home. The guns didn't care which kind of man was loading them. They fired the same either way. What happened afterward to the youngest men acquitted at Cape Coast Castle is, frustratingly, mostly lost to us. Colonial record-keeping of this era rarely followed up on men who'd simply been released and sent on their way. And the surviving trial documents, thorough as they are about the proceedings themselves, go largely quiet on what became of any individual defendant once the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied. It's a small, honest gap worth naming rather than papering over. Some of those boys almost certainly went home, found other trades, lived out ordinary lives that left no further mark on any surviving record at all. Others may well have drifted back toward the sea, toward piracy, or something close enough to it. Having learned by then that the line between forced crew member and willing one could blur awfully fast once a man had already lived through it once. We simply don't know. And pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of invented certainty this whole story has tried to avoid. The Swallow herself suffered comparatively minor damage in the engagement, a testament to the disorganization that had crept into Roberts's crew in the weeks before the battle. A period during which discipline aboard the Royal Fortune had reportedly grown looser than at the height of his career. Accounts suggest heavy drinking the night before the encounter contributed directly to the sluggish, poorly coordinated response when the Swallow finally revealed herself as a warship rather than easy prey. It's a detail worth holding on to, because it complicates the image of the gun deck as a place of constant grim professional discipline. It was, sometimes, exactly that, and it was also, sometimes, undone by nothing more dramatic than ordinary human exhaustion, overconfidence, and a bad night's sleep. Challoner Ogle himself did rather well out of that morning's work. Word of Roberts's death and the mass trial that followed at Cape Coast Castle travelled back to England well ahead of Ogle's own return, and he was knighted for the achievement, the only Royal Navy officer of the entire Golden Age of Piracy to receive that specific honour for hunting down a pirate captain. A measure of just how significant Roberts' career had become in the eyes of the trading companies and the government both. It's a tidy, almost ironic bookend to Roberts' own story. A man who began as a pressed sailor with no interest in piracy at all ended his life making another man's entire career, on the opposite side of exactly the same guns. Bartholomew Roberts went into the water off Cape Lopez without a grave anyone could ever visit, his body given to the ocean by the same articles that had governed every other part of his crew's life together. The vote for captain, the shared risk, the compensation scale, the small measure of dignity a pirate crew extended to its own, even in the worst possible moment. His career, by the numbers alone, remains one of the most successful in the entire history of Atlantic piracy. His death took less time than it took you to fire your gun 11 times back on that quieter morning. That's the arithmetic the gun deck always came back to, on every ship, in every engagement, no matter how famous the man standing on the quarterdeck happened to be. Roberts died on his feet, in the open, in the space of a single exchange of fire. Most men who fell to gunfire on a deck like this weren't so fortunate as to go quickly. What waited for the wounded below decks, in the aftermath of a battle, is its own particular kind of history, and it starts with a detail almost nobody expects. Your ears are ringing before you even register that you've been hit, and for a strange, suspended half-second, you genuinely can't tell what happened. No pain yet. Just a wetness spreading across your forearm, and a sound like tearing canvas that seems to be coming from somewhere very far away. Then, it arrives all at once, and you understand, with a clarity that has nothing to do with wisdom and everything to do with animal instinct, that you need to get below. Here's the detail that surprises almost everyone learning about naval combat of this period for the first time. It wasn't usually the cannonball itself that hurt you. Solid shot passing clean through a hull or across an open deck was, relative to the alternative, almost merciful. It either missed a person entirely or it didn't, and if it didn't, there was rarely much left to treat. The far more common and far more survivable injury, the one that filled the surgeon's cockpit below decks after nearly every engagement, came from splinters, jagged fragments of wood, some the length of your forearm, blasted outward at tremendous velocity from a hull or deck beam struck by an incoming ball. A single well-placed shot could send dozens of these fragments scything across a crowded gun deck, and it's these wooden splinters, not the iron shot that caused them, that accounted for the majority of documented battle injuries and deaths aboard sailing warships throughout this entire era. Your arm, it turns out, has been opened by a piece of your own ship. The companionway down to the surgeon's cockpit is narrow enough that two men can't pass each other comfortably even on a calm day. And today, it's clogged. Someone ahead of you moving slowly. Someone behind you moving too fast. All of it lit by nothing more than a single swinging lantern that throws everyone's shadow huge and shuddering against the low ceiling. By the time you reach the bottom, the space itself, usually just an unremarkable stretch of orlop deck below the waterline, has been transformed. A table cleared and laid with tools, a lantern hung directly above it, and a man everyone aboard calls Dr. Pruitt, working with a speed and a grim economy of motion that tells you, more than anything he could say aloud, exactly how many times he's done this before. The chest itself sits open on a second, smaller table, and even in your current state you notice how carefully everything inside it has been arranged. Saws for bone, knives of several distinct sizes, a tourniquet, needles and waxed thread for closing wounds, a stock of dried herbs and rum used more for cleaning than for any comfort it might offer the patient. Rum's reputation as a battlefield anesthetic is, if you're being honest with yourself later, mostly wishful thinking. It dulled a man's nerve to scream more than it dulled the actual sensation of a saw through bone. But it was what was available. And availability down here counted for more than ideal medicine ever could. Disease, not injury, remained the single largest killer aboard any ship of this era, pirate or otherwise. Dysentery, scurvy, fever spread easily in the cramped, damp, poorly ventilated space below decks, where dozens of men lived on top of each other for months at a stretch. Today's battle wounds are, in a strange way, the more survivable half of Pruitt's job. It's the slow, unglamorous sickness that fills more of his hours across a typical voyage than any single engagement ever does. Pruitt isn't a physician in the sense that word implies today. Most ship surgeons of this era learned their trade through years of practical apprenticeship rather than formal medical education. And the line between surgeon and barber, historically, had only recently begun to blur apart in most of Europe. What he has, though, is speed, a steady hand, and a small, carefully guarded chest of instruments that represents, in its own quiet way, one of the most valuable pieces of cargo any pirate crew could hope to capture. Ship's articles across numerous documented pirate crews specifically singled out a captured vessel's surgeon and his instruments for special treatment, sometimes an entire extra share of plunder set aside just to secure a skilled surgeon's willing service. Because a crew without one was a crew that died of infections and untreated wounds that a trained hand might otherwise have managed. What happens next isn't glamorous, and nothing about it should be. Pruitt works down the line of wounded with a triage instinct born entirely of experience rather than formal training. Treating what can be saved first, setting aside what can't. Moving fast, because speed itself is often the difference between survival and infection in wounds this dirty. Delivered by splintered wood-dragging fouled cloth and gundeck grime deep into torn flesh. For a wound like yours, deep, but clean of any embedded fragment he can't remove quickly. It's a matter of cleaning it as thoroughly as anyone can manage with the tools available, closing it, and moving on to the next man, waiting his turn with a bloodied rag, pressed to whatever part of himself he's trying to hold together. For wounds involving a shattered limb, the calculus is different, and considerably darker. Amputation in this period remained one of the only real treatments available for a limb crushed or mangled beyond any hope of saving, and a skilled surgeon could complete one, cutting through muscle and bone, tying off vessels, closing the stump, in a matter of a few brutal minutes. Speed itself being the only mercy available in an era centuries before anesthesia existed in any meaningful form. It's here, in this specific horror, that one of the genuinely remarkable features of pirate life becomes visible. And it's worth sitting with, because it stands in sharp contrast to almost everything else about the era. Numerous surviving sets of pirate ships' articles, the same written agreements that governed the vote for captain and the division of shares, included specific detailed compensation for exactly this outcome. The articles associated with a captain named John Phillips, for instance, laid out precise payments, a set sum for the loss of a right arm, a somewhat lesser sum for a left, specific amounts for an eye or a finger, drawn first from whatever plunder the ship had taken before the rest of the crew's shares were even calculated. It wasn't generous by any modern measure. But it was real. It was written down in advance, and it meant a man who lost a limb below decks in that cockpit wasn't simply cast aside once he could no longer haul rope or man a gun. He walked away, if he survived at all, with something, a payout no ordinary merchant sailor of the same era could ever have expected from the ship that maimed him. The specific numbers varied from crew to crew, but the underlying structure shows up again and again across the surviving sets of articles historians have been able to document. Bartholomew Roberts' own crew, the same men who would carry his body to the rail off Cape Lopez years later, sailed under articles that similarly set aside compensation for the loss of limbs and eyes ahead of the general division of shares. And other captains across the era followed comparable schemes, adjusting the exact sums but rarely abandoning the principle itself. It's not that pirate crews were uniquely generous or uniquely kind. Plenty about this life was brutal by any measure, and these were, after all, men who'd built a career on violence and theft. But the articles reflect a plain, unsentimental piece of self-interest dressed up as fairness. A crew that knew it would be compensated for exactly this kind of catastrophic loss was a crew more willing to stand at the guns in the first place, and a captain who honored that promise consistently kept better. Steadier hands willing to serve under him voyage after voyage. The surgery itself, brutal as it is, isn't actually the most dangerous part of what a man in that cockpit faces. The days that follow are. Infection, in an era without any real understanding of what caused it, killed a significant number of men who survived the initial wound and the initial cut entirely, fever setting in days later. A stump or a closed wound, turning hot and swollen and foul-smelling, in a way that everyone aboard recognized by grim experience as a very bad sign. Pruitt's tools are cleaned as well as the era allows, rinsed in seawater or rum between patients, but the germ theory of disease sits more than a century in the future, and the difference between a wound that healed clean and one that turned septic often came down to little more than luck, the specific nature of the injury, and how quickly a man had reached the cockpit in the first place. It's a hard thing to sit with, this late in the story, that surviving the guns and surviving the surgeon's table still left a man facing a third and quieter danger. One that could take him just as surely over the following week as any cannonball could have taken him in the moment itself. There's a particular sound that fills the cockpit during moments like this one that no account, however detailed, quite manages to convey on paper, and it's worth naming honestly rather than skipping past. The low, ragged breathing of men trying very hard not to scream, because a man who screams draws attention he doesn't necessarily want and unsettles the crewmates waiting their own turn on. Pruitt's table. Some bite down on a strip of leather or a knotted rag, less for any real dulling of pain than for something solid to clench against. It's not dignity, exactly, in the way we might use that word today. It's closer to a kind of grim, communal restraint, an unspoken agreement that whatever any one man was feeling, the rest of the cockpit didn't need to carry it too. On top of everything else this morning had already asked of them. Lying there, waiting your turn to be checked over one final time, you find yourself thinking back to that smouldering ember Ned caught mid-battle, the one nobody else even noticed him deal with. You understand it properly now, in a way you didn't at the time. Had that ember gone unchecked, the next cartridge rammed home behind it wouldn't have waited for the slow match at all. It would have ignited the instant it touched the barrel, likely while a man's hands or forearms were still braced against the rammer, close enough to the muzzle to lose fingers. A hand, an arm. In the same instant the gun fired early and uncontrolled. It's not a dramatic story to tell afterward, because nothing happened. That's precisely the point. The worst injuries on any gun deck, this whole night has quietly insisted, weren't always the ones inflicted by an enemy at all. They were the ones prevented, one extra careful beat of a sponge at a time, by men like Ned who never once mentioned it afterward, because to him, it wasn't an achievement. It was simply the job, done correctly, the same way it needed to be done correctly every single time before it. By the time Pruitt finishes with your arm stitched, wrapped, and throbbing in a way that will announce itself for weeks, the fighting above has gone quiet, and the cockpit has settled into the particular hush that follows this kind of work, punctuated only by someone a few feet away, breathing in short, controlled gasps against pain he's refusing to give voice to any louder than that. You think, lying there with your arm on fire and your ears still ringing faintly, about Tom, the powder monkey from a few mornings back, and you find yourself hoping, with a fierceness that surprises you, that wherever he is right now, he's still whole. Not every wound this cockpit treats leaves a visible mark either, and it's worth naming that plainly, even though the historical record has far less to say about it than it does about severed limbs and gunshot wounds, men who survived engagement after engagement, watching crewmates die or maimed beside them, carried something forward from each one that never showed up on any ship's articles, and never earned any payout at all. We don't have detailed first-hand accounts of what that weight felt like to the men living under it. The language and the framework for describing it simply didn't exist yet in the way it does now. But it would be its own kind of dishonesty to pretend a man could walk away from mornings like this one, again and again, across years at sea, entirely unchanged by any of it. Some of that weight, almost certainly, is exactly why crews like this one leaned so heavily on the small, specific kindnesses this deck has shown you tonight. A cuff on the shoulder, a name painted on a gun barrel, a compensation scale written down in advance. Not enough to undo what the guns cost, but something offered by men who understood, better than most, exactly what that cost actually was. There's a longer story underneath the compensation scale Pruitt's articles promise, one that stretches well past tonight and well past this particular cockpit. A man who lost a limb to a splinter or a badly recoiling gun and survived the fever that so often followed didn't simply vanish from the historical record once his voyaging days ended. Some settled in port towns across the Caribbean and North American colonies with whatever payout their articles had guaranteed them. A sum that, however modest by any standard, represented genuine capital in a world where an ordinary disabled labourer ashore had essentially no equivalent safety net at all. It's a small, specific kindness embedded directly into the structure of pirate life, easy to miss amid everything else this deck has shown you tonight, and worth holding on to precisely because it complicates the easy assumption that a pirate crew cared nothing at all for its own wounded, once they could no longer haul a rope or serve a gun. He is, as it turns out, you'll learn this later, once you're back on your feet. Though it's a near thing, a splinter caught him across the shoulder during this same engagement. Shallow enough that Pruitt handled it in minutes rather than hours, and by evening Tom is back on deck, arm in a rough sling, telling anyone who'll listen about the share he's going to collect from today's haul, with the same undimmed enthusiasm he had before any of this started. There's something almost unbearably tender in that, in an 11-year-old boy's capacity to be genuinely, uncomplicatedly excited about a number on a ledger a few hours after nearly losing an arm to a piece of his own ship. It's not naivety, exactly. It's closer to resilience, small, stubborn, and entirely real. The same resilience that let every man in this cockpit tonight, wounded and whole alike, wake up tomorrow and do it all again. The wounded heal, or they don't. And either way, the ship still needs guns to fight with tomorrow. Which raises a question that every pirate captain running a crew like this one had to answer over and over again, prize after prize. Where, exactly, do you get more? You're standing on the deck of a captured merchant snow, with a length of chalk in your hand. And the man beside you, the ship's carpenter, a careful, unhurried presence named Abel, who spent more hours than anyone aboard thinking about exactly how much weight a wooden hull can take before it starts complaining, is watching you do arithmetic you were never taught to do on land. As quartermaster, dividing up the spoils of a prize is your job, and this morning the spoils in question aren't coin or cloth. They're guns. 4 of them, sitting in the snow's own gun deck. And the question in front of you is deceptively simple. Do they come aboard your ship? Or do they stay where they are? It's worth pausing on why this particular decision belongs to you at all, rather than to the captain standing on the same deck a few dozen feet away. The quartermaster, aboard most documented pirate crews, was an elected position in its own right, chosen by the same crew vote that chose the captain, and carried real, specific authority that existed largely to check the captain's power rather than simply extend it, dividing plunder fairly, settling disputes among the crew, and, in many crews' actual practice, taking direct command of boarding parties and the disposition of a captured prize. Exactly the kind of decision you're wrestling with alongside Abel this morning. It's an unusual structure for the era, a deliberate built-in balance of power that most legitimate naval and merchant vessels of the same period simply didn't offer their own ordinary crew at all, where a captain's word was close to absolute and nobody elected anybody. Pirate crews, for all their violence, were often quietly more democratic in their internal governance than almost any other institution their own crew members would have encountered back on land. Here's the part almost nobody thinks about when they picture a pirate ship bristling with cannon. Those guns didn't arrive as a set, and they didn't arrive for free. Every single one of them came from somewhere, captured, like these four, or occasionally purchased outright from a corrupt merchant or colonial official willing to look past where a ship's silver actually came from, or, in rarer cases, simply left aboard a vessel that surrendered its cargo and crew, but was itself allowed to sail on. Building and maintaining a pirate ship's firepower was an ongoing, opportunistic, genuinely difficult logistical problem, and it fell, in no small part, to you. Abel's first concern, and it's a real one, is weight and balance. A ship built as a merchant snow was designed by her original builders to carry a specific cargo, distributed a specific way, and every gun you add changes that calculation. Too much weight too high in the hull, and the ship becomes dangerously unstable, prone to capsizing in exactly the kind of sudden squall that the Atlantic and Caribbean produce with alarming regularity. Too much weight concentrated on one side, and she lists permanently, sailing awkwardly and slowly in exactly the situation, being chased or chasing, where speed matters most. Abel walks the deck with you, tapping beams, checking how she's currently trimmed in the water, and makes a call that surprises you. Only 2 of the 4 guns come aboard. The other 2, heavier demi-culverins that would push the ship's balance past what her frame can comfortably bear, get left with the prize crew sent to sail the captured snow to a friendly port to be sold, along with the cargo that made this whole capture worthwhile in the first place. Guns don't just need to be won, they need to be kept, and keeping them meant every few months, hauling the entire ship out of the water for careening, tipping her onto her side in some quiet, uninhabited cove, well away from any naval patrol, to scrape the hull clean of the barnacles and weed that could slow her by several knots if left unchecked. Every gun on the affected side has to come off the deck first, unbolted and lowered by tackle onto the beach or into waiting boats. Because a ship heeled over on her side with a full battery of iron still lashed to the upper deck is a ship one bad gust away from never coming back upright at all. It's brutal, unglamorous labor, days of it, and it's also, not incidentally, the only real opportunity anyone gets to inspect each gun up close, checking for the kind of deep corrosion that salt air and months at sea inevitably cause, deciding which pieces are still trustworthy and which have quietly become more dangerous to their own crew than to any enemy. More than one gun, across the historical record, was condemned and left behind entirely during a careening, judged too weakened by rust and pitting to risk firing again. A quiet, undramatic kind of loss that never makes it into the popular telling of a pirate crew's story, but mattered enormously to the men who would have been standing behind it the next time it fired. Careening isn't the only maintenance a gun needs, either, and Abel mentions, almost in passing, the far more frequent smaller ritual that keeps a gun's iron from simply dissolving away between those larger overhauls. Every few weeks, weather and workload allowing, each barrel gets a fresh coat of blacking worked into the metal by hand, the same tar and lamp-black mixture Ned uses back on your own ship, reapplied constantly, because salt air undoes the previous coat faster than anyone would like. It's tedious, filthy work, hands stained black for days afterward, and it earns no glory whatsoever in any account of a pirate crew's exploits. But a gun left unblacked for even a single month in humid tropical air can develop enough surface rust to compromise how evenly it fires. And a gun left unblacked for a season can develop the kind of deep pitting that eventually condemns it entirely. The same fate you and Abel are trying to avoid deciding on this very morning for the two guns you've chosen to bring aboard. Sam Bellamy, captain of the slave ship turned pirate flagship Wider Galley, offers a useful contrast to the careful incremental approach you and Abel are taking this morning. Bellamy captured the Wider in early 1717, as she carried the same kind of forced human cargo as La Concorde would carry into Blackbeard's hands later that same year, and rather than the slow, prize-by-prize accumulation typical of most crews, Bellamy upgunned her rapidly, reportedly reaching something in the range of 28 guns within a remarkably short span, an aggressive pace that reflected his crew's aggressive run of captures across the same period. It didn't save her. The Wider wrecked off the coast of Cape Cod in a violent storm that same April, taking Bellamy and the overwhelming majority of his crew down with her. A reminder that no amount of firepower, however quickly assembled, meant anything at all against wind and open water. Her wreck, like Blackbeard's flagship, would eventually be located by modern researchers. Her own recovered cannon now sitting in museum collections, not far from where she went down. One more ship whose guns outlasted the men who fought so hard to collect them. Not every captain exercised the same restraint Abel is pushing you toward this morning, and the era's shipping losses record the consequences plainly enough. Even when a specific cause can't always be pinned down with certainty after the fact, a merchant or naval vessel of the period, converted hastily and loaded well beyond what her original builders intended, could and sometimes did founder in exactly the kind of sudden squall that swallowed Bellamy's Wider. Top-heavy hulls rolling further and recovering slower than their crews expected, until, in the worst cases, they simply didn't recover at all. It's impossible, this many centuries later, to say with confidence how many pirate vessels were lost specifically because an ambitious captain pushed a hull past what she could safely carry rather than to storm, poor seamanship, or simple bad luck. The ocean rarely leaves a note explaining itself. But every experienced sailor of the era understood the general danger well enough that it shaped decisions like the one you and Abel are making this very morning. A quiet, ever-present caution running underneath every captain's more aggressive ambitions. This kind of decision happened constantly, across the entire Golden Age, and it explains something that puzzles people looking at the historical record for the first time: why some pirate captains commanding multiple vessels chose to deliberately concentrate their heaviest guns on a single flagship rather than spreading firepower evenly across every ship they controlled. Bartholomew Roberts, at points during his career, commanded a small squadron of vessels sailing in company, and rather than distributing armament equally, he consolidated his most powerful guns aboard his primary ship, using the smaller consorts more for speed, scouting, and additional crew capacity than as independently threatening warships in their own right. It's a system-level decision, made ship by ship, prize by prize, by quartermasters exactly like you're pretending to be this morning, and it shaped more than almost any other single factor how a pirate fleet actually fought when it mattered. Roberts, across the different phases of his career, sailed at various points with vessels he named and renamed almost as often as he captured new ones. A fortune, a royal fortune, a ranger, and other consorts that came and went as prizes were taken, stripped, sold, or simply outgrown. Each time his fleet's composition shifted, the same basic redistribution problem you're solving this morning had to be solved all over again. Guns and trained men reshuffled across however many hulls he currently commanded. And it's a genuinely remarkable piece of ongoing logistics management to have sustained successfully across a career spanning roughly 3 years and hundreds of individual captures. It didn't run itself. Somebody aboard every one of those ships was doing exactly what you're doing right now, chalk in hand, working out which guns moved and which stayed behind, over and over again, for as long as Roberts kept sailing. There's a second consideration, less obvious than weight, that Abel raises next: ammunition compatibility. A Saker firing a 5 or 6 pound ball needs shot cast to roughly that size. A demi-culverin firing 9-pound shot needs its own separate supply. Every additional gun type you bring aboard, no matter how impressive it looks bolted to the deck, comes with its own separate ammunition requirement, and a ship carrying 6 different gun calibers is a ship that needs to store, track, and correctly distribute 6 different types of shot in the heat of an engagement. A genuine tactical liability if a gun crew, in the chaos and smoke of actual combat, grabs the wrong-sized ball for their piece. Experienced quartermasters, over time, generally worked to standardize a ship's armament as much as circumstances allowed, favoring guns of similar caliber even if it meant leaving a perfectly serviceable captured cannon behind, because its ammunition wouldn't work with anything else already aboard. It's an unglamorous kind of strategic thinking, invisible in most of the popular imagery of pirate ships, and it mattered enormously to whether a crew survived its next real fight. There's also the simple, blunt matter of who actually knows how to use a captured gun correctly. A ship might take a prize carrying excellent, well-maintained artillery, only to discover that consolidating it means overloading the existing, already stretched gun crews with more pieces than they can effectively serve. More guns without more trained hands to work them is, in practice, often worse than fewer guns crewed well. Because a gun manned by an inexperienced or undersized crew reloads slower, aims worse, and in the worst case becomes a hazard to the men trying to operate it, rather than an asset against the enemy. Some captains, weighing exactly this problem, chose deliberately to strip a captured vessel of everything except her guns and sink or release the empty hull, rather than try to sail her onward. Better to concentrate trained men around fewer. Better served pieces than to spread thin expertise across an impressive-looking but poorly functioning battery. There's one more piece of arithmetic worth mentioning before you and Abel finish here, and it's the one that ties this whole logistical puzzle back to why anyone signed the ship's articles in the first place. Guns left behind rather than brought aboard weren't simply abandoned. They stayed with the captured vessel, sold along with her, at whatever port the prize crew eventually reached, and the proceeds folded into the same divisible pool of plunder that every man aboard, from Ned at his gun to Tom running powder, held a documented, voted-upon share in. A gun too heavy or too redundant to be useful in a fight was still worth real money to a crew that understood, better than almost anyone else afloat in this era, that not every valuable thing needed to be kept. Sometimes the most useful thing a quartermaster could do with a captured cannon was leave it exactly where it was, and let it be sold for coin that every man aboard could actually spend. By the time you and Abel finish your survey, the morning's decision comes down to exactly 2 guns transferred, both matched in caliber to pieces already aboard your own ship, both assigned to gun crews with room to absorb an additional piece without stretching too thin. It's not a dramatic moment. Nobody's writing songs about a quartermaster and a carpenter doing careful arithmetic on a captured merchant snow's deck. But it's this kind of decision, repeated dozens of times across a career, prize after prize, that actually determined whether a pirate ship's guns worked when they needed to. Not the number stamped into ship's lore afterward, but the patient, unglamorous work of matching weight to hull, ammunition to caliber, and guns to the hands available to serve them. Somewhere out there, on a ship you haven't met yet, one particular captain took this exact same puzzle and pushed it about as far as it could possibly go. assembling, prize by prize. One of the most heavily armed vessels any pirate crew ever put to sea. That's where we're headed to close out tonight. Most crews built their firepower a gun or two at a time, exactly the way you just did. Careful, incremental, constrained by weight and ammunition and trained hands. One crew, under one particular captain, did it differently, all at once, off the back of a single extraordinary capture. Their story is the story of a ship whose guns outlived everyone who ever fired them. On the 28th of November 1717, off the island of Martinique, a French slave ship called La Concorde found herself surrounded. She was 200 tons, carrying somewhere in the range of 450 enslaved Africans, in conditions of unimaginable cruelty, along with a crew already weakened by weeks at sea and an outbreak of dysentery that had left much of them too sick to fight. The vessels closing on her belonged to a pirate flotilla under the command of a man the historical record calls Edward Teach, though he is far better known by the name history remembers him by. Blackbeard, La Concorde's captain, facing overwhelming numbers and a crew in no condition to resist, surrendered without a fight. It was, in the strict arithmetic of that morning, an easy capture. What it became, in Blackbeard's hands over the following weeks, was something else entirely. This is the story of the ship that would come to be called Queen Anne's Revenge, the flagship that made Blackbeard the single most feared name on the Atlantic seaboard for a period of roughly 6 months, and the ship whose actual physical remains, recovered from the ocean floor more than 2.5 centuries after she sank, would go on to teach modern historians more about how a real pirate gun deck actually worked than almost any written record from the period ever could. The name Blackbeard chose for her carries its own small, pointed irony worth pausing on. Queen Anne had died in 1714, 3 years before La Concorde's capture, and the war fought largely in her name, the War of the Spanish Succession, had ended that same year with the Treaty of Utrecht, a peace that, among other things, threw thousands of trained sailors and privateers out of legitimate wartime employment all at once, many of whom drifted directly into piracy simply because it was the only trade they still knew how to practice. Naming his flagship after a recently deceased queen and a recently concluded war was, in that light, less a gesture of loyalty than something closer to dark commentary. A reminder, worn on the ship's own bow, of exactly the kind of peace that had helped create men like Blackbeard in the first place, cast loose from one violent trade only to take up another. La Concorde herself, before ever falling into Blackbeard's hands, was already no stranger to cannon. French slave ships of her size typically sailed with somewhere in the range of 14 to 16 guns, enough to deter the kind of opportunistic attack her own crew clearly feared while crossing the Atlantic, though evidently not enough to deter a determined, well-coordinated pirate flotilla closing on a ship already weakened by illness. Those original guns, smaller and lighter than what Blackbeard would eventually mount aboard her, formed only the starting point of what became Queen Anne's Revenge's armament, and it's worth remembering, given everything you've learnt tonight about how difficult and incremental arming a ship usually was, just how unusual Blackbeard's rapid escalation from roughly 16 guns to something approaching 40 actually represents. It wasn't the work of one lucky capture. It was the work of an entire flotilla operating in concert. Months of accumulated captures consolidated deliberately onto a single hull. Exactly the kind of large-scale version of the careful arithmetic you and Abel worked through earlier tonight, scaled up by a captain with both the ambition and the fleet to actually attempt it. Blackbeard's first order of business, once La Concorde was secured, was liberation of a particularly grim and specific kind. Freeing the vessel of her human cargo was not by any surviving account driven by moral objection to the slave trade itself. Several formerly enslaved men were, according to documented record, forcibly incorporated into his own crew rather than freed outright, a detail that complicates any tidy version of this story considerably. What mattered to Blackbeard, in purely practical terms, was that La Concorde herself was a large, sturdy, well-built hull. Exactly the kind of vessel a pirate captain dreamed of getting his hands on. And he set about transforming her with a speed and an ambition that outstripped almost anything else documented from the era. Renamed Queen Anne's Revenge, the ship underwent a rapid, extensive refit. And here is where the numbers become genuinely remarkable. Modern archaeological and historical estimates suggest Blackbeard eventually armed her with as many as 40 guns, a figure that would have made her comparable in raw firepower to a small naval warship of the period. An extraordinary armament for a vessel operating entirely outside any government's authority. Where did 40 guns come from? The same place every gun on every pirate ship you've learnt about tonight came from, prize after prize, captured and stripped, consolidated aboard a single hull specifically chosen. The way Abel chose which guns to bring aboard your ship, because her frame and her reputation could bear the weight and the theatre of it. A ship carrying 40 guns didn't just fight better. She announced herself from the horizon in a way that made the shot across the bow calculation Snellgrave faced years earlier almost unnecessary. Few merchant captains needed much convincing once they understood exactly which vessel was closing on them. Blackbeard put that reputation and that firepower to its most audacious use in May of 1718, when he sailed Queen Anne's Revenge, accompanied by several smaller consort vessels, directly into the approach to Charleston Harbor in the colony of South Carolina, and simply stopped there, blockading one of the busiest ports in British North America for the better part of a week. Ships attempting to enter or leave were stopped and boarded, their passengers and crew held, and Blackbeard, in a piece of theatre almost unmatched in the entire era, sent a specific demand ashore to the colony's governor, a chest of medicine, in exchange for the release of his hostages, several of whom, by contemporary accounts, included prominent local citizens. The governor, facing an armed blockade backed by roughly 40 guns sitting at the mouth of his colony's most vital harbour, complied. It's one of the clearest documented demonstrations, anywhere in the historical record, of exactly what a gun deck like the one you toured tonight could accomplish without a single shot being fired in anger, pure, undiluted leverage, backed by iron. It didn't last. Barely a month later, in June of 1718, Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground on a sandbar near Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, and was lost. Here, the historical record does something it rarely does elsewhere in this story. It hands us a genuine, still debated mystery, rather than a settled fact. Some historians, examining the circumstances of the grounding, believe it was a straightforward navigational accident, the kind of misfortune that claimed countless ships of the era on treacherous, poorly charted coastal waters. Others argue, based on the timing and Blackbeard's subsequent actions, that the grounding may have been deliberate, a calculated move by Blackbeard to strand and abandon a portion of his own crew, reducing the number of men he'd eventually have to split plunder and, more importantly, a royal pardon with, at a moment when amnesty for pirates willing to surrender was being actively offered by colonial authorities. We genuinely don't know which explanation is correct, and anyone presenting either version as settled fact is going further than the actual evidence supports. What we do know is that Blackbeard survived the wreck, moved on with a smaller, more selective crew, and was killed himself only months later, in November of 1718, in a bloody engagement off Ocracoke Island against a force sent specifically to hunt him down. There's a bitter irony worth pausing on in exactly how Blackbeard met his end that November, one that speaks directly to everything you've spent tonight learning about how these guns actually worked. By the time Lieutenant Robert Maynard's two small sloops closed on him near Ocracoke Island, Blackbeard was no longer aboard the mighty 40-gun Queen Anne's Revenge at all. She was already lost on that sandbar months earlier. But even setting that aside, Maynard had deliberately chosen shallow, narrow water for the approach specifically because it neutralized the advantage heavy guns would otherwise provide. A vessel's cannon, however numerous, are only useful if they can actually be brought to bear on a target within their arc of fire, and in tight, shoal-ridden channels, that geometry breaks down fast. The engagement that finally killed Blackbeard was decided almost entirely by pistol and cutlass in a close, brutal hand-to-hand fight on Maynard's own deck. The same quarterdeck weapons you learned about several chapters back, stepping in exactly where the big guns, for once, simply couldn't reach. It's a small, sharp reminder that no amount of firepower solves every kind of fight, and that the men who hunted pirates for a living learned that lesson every bit as thoroughly as the pirates themselves ever did. Queen Anne's Revenge, meanwhile, settled into the sand and silt of Beaufort Inlet, and stayed there, forgotten by everyone except the occasional fisherman whose nets snagged on something unidentifiable beneath the waves, for 278 years. In November of 1996, a private research firm called Intersal Inc., working under license from the state of North Carolina, located a wreck site roughly a mile and a half offshore, designated in official records simply as Site 31CR314. It would take years of careful, patient archaeological work, the kind that moves in inches rather than headlines, before researchers felt confident enough in the accumulated evidence, including artifacts, cargo, and the sheer scale of the ship's remains, to identify the site with real confidence as Blackbeard's lost flagship. What they found down there, preserved in cold, dark water for nearly 3 centuries, was an almost unbelievable gift to everyone who has ever wondered exactly how a ship like the one you toured tonight actually worked. More than 30 cannons have been recovered and documented from the site in the years since, many of them concreted together with sand, shell, and corrosion into dense masses that had to be carefully, painstakingly excavated and conserved rather than simply lifted from the seabed. Alongside the guns themselves, researchers recovered cannonballs, sounding weights, surgical tools bearing a startling and specific resemblance to the kind of instrument set Dr. Pruitt might have carried in his own chest, and a small brass bell bearing a date that helped confirm the vessel's identity beyond reasonable doubt. Every single object pulled from that wreck site has done more to confirm, correct, and enrich the written record of how these ships actually functioned than any single surviving document from the period ever managed alone. Because wood and iron, unlike ink, don't exaggerate for a reading public back in London hungry for a good story. Getting a single cannon from the seabed into a condition where it can even be studied, let alone displayed, is its own multi-year undertaking. And it's worth understanding just how far removed that process is from simply hauling a gun up and hosing it off. Each concreted mass, cannon, shot, and surrounding sediment, often fused together by nearly 3 centuries of marine growth and mineral deposit into something closer to a single strange rock than a recognizable object, first gets X-rayed, allowing conservators to see the actual gun hidden inside the crust before they ever touch it with a tool. Only then does the painstaking mechanical removal of that crust begin, followed by a process called electrolytic reduction, in which the artifact sits submerged in a chemical bath for months or even years, while a mild electrical current slowly draws embedded chlorides out of the iron. Salt that would otherwise continue corroding the metal from the inside even after it was pulled from the ocean. Skip that step. Rush it, and a recovered cannon that survived 278 years underwater can crumble into flaking, unstable fragments within a few years of exposure to open air. It's a strange kind of symmetry, the same patient, unglamorous discipline that kept Gunnar Hollis's powder dry and Ned's breaching ropes checked between every shot is exactly what keeps these same guns intact today. Just practiced now by scientists in laboratory coats rather than pirates in salt-stained canvas. Walk into the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort today, not far at all from the sandbar where this whole story ran aground, and you can stand in front of some of these very guns yourself. Squat, dark, pitted iron shapes resting quietly behind glass, labeled with careful museum text explaining provenance and conservation timelines in the same patient. Unromantic language a shipping manifest might once have used. Visitors lean in close, the way you leaned in close to Ned's row of guns back at the very start of tonight's journey. And it's easy to forget, looking at something so still and so obviously finished with its work, that each one of these pieces once demanded exactly the kind of trained, coordinated, dangerous human labor you spent this whole night learning about. Sponged, loaded, run out, and fired by men whose names, in almost every case, didn't survive nearly as well as the iron they served. None of this recovery work happens in a vacuum, either, and the researchers involved have been careful, in their public presentations of the site, not to let the genuine wonder of the archaeology entirely eclipse the ship's origin as a vessel of the slave trade before she was ever a pirate flagship at all. La Concorde's 450 captive Africans don't appear in the museum displays of recovered cannon and surgical tools quite as prominently as the guns themselves do, and that quiet imbalance is itself a kind of lesson about which parts of history tend to get preserved in iron and bronze, and which parts survive only in the gaps between the artifacts. In the cargo manifests and the human lives those manifests represented far more than they ever bothered to record. A gun corrodes, gets recovered, gets conserved, and eventually sits behind glass for the wonder of visitors centuries later. A human life, taken and sold and worked and often lost entirely to history, rarely gets the same treatment. Both truths belong to this ship's story, and neither one erases the other. That small brass bell deserves a moment of its own, because it did more to settle the identity of this wreck than almost anything else pulled from the site. Ships of this era rarely carried anything stamped with an obvious nameplate the way a modern vessel might, and archaeologists spent years working from indirect evidence alone. The sheer number and size of the recovered cannon, the ship's approximate dimensions reconstructed from her surviving timbers, artifacts consistent with a French origin, matching what's known of La Concorde. The bell, bearing a date that aligned precisely with the vessel's known history, offered something closer to direct confirmation, the kind of single, unambiguous data point that lets careful researchers finally say, with real confidence rather than accumulated probability, exactly which ship they've spent years quietly excavating. It's a small object to carry that much weight, no larger than a man's two fists together, and it sat in the sand for 278 years, waiting for someone to finally ask it the right question. The work continues today, more than a quarter century after the wreck's rediscovery, conducted by North Carolina's Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, with individual cannons still undergoing years-long conservation processes designed to stabilize iron and bronze that spent nearly 3 centuries slowly dissolving in salt water. Some of the recovered guns are now on public display, sitting in museum cases where visitors can stand close enough to see, with their own eyes, the exact scale and weight of the pieces that once decided, in minutes, the fate of ships like Snellgrave's Bird or Roberts's Royal Fortune. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable full-circle stories in all of pirate history. A ship built by force, armed by plunder, lost to either accident or calculation nobody living can settle for certain, and finally recovered not by treasure hunters chasing gold, but by patient archaeologists chasing the far rarer treasure of simply understanding. in precise and physical detail. Exactly how something this dangerous actually worked. And that, in the end, is the real story the gun deck tells. Not the flag, not the legend, but the guns themselves. The ropes that held them, the boys who fed them powder, and the surgeons who patched what they broke. You walked that deck tonight with Ned, who checked a breaching rope between every single shot, because he'd seen what happened when someone didn't. You watched Snellgrave strike his colours a beat too late off the coast of West Africa, and you fired 11 shots yourself alongside Tom, who talked about his share of the prize with the same excitement whether his arm was whole or freshly wrapped in a sling. You stood in Gunnar Hollis's silent, careful magazine, and in Dr. Pruitt's blood-marked cockpit, and you did the quiet, unglamorous arithmetic of deciding which captured guns were worth the wait. And you followed one particular ship, 40 guns strong. From a captured slaver off Martinique, to a sandbar off North Carolina, to a museum case where her recovered cannons sit today, patient and still, finally at rest after 278 years underwater. Somewhere off that same North Carolina coast tonight, the tide is moving quietly over Site 31 CR 34 the way it has every night since 1718, indifferent to everything it once carried. The guns that are left down there are silent now, and have been for a very long time, and the men who loaded and fired and feared them are long past caring what became of any of it. You, on the other hand, are still here, warm, dry, lying somewhere with no gunpowder anywhere near you, no breaching rope to check, no drum calling you up out of sleep toward anything at all. The gun deck did its work all those centuries ago, and finished it. Tonight, yours is already done. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.